Hi, I'm Hillary Earle, and welcome to Mediation Master Class. Today we're going to be talking about subtle or subconscious bias and how it might be impacting your mediation style. So one of the most important features parties are looking for, or characteristics in a mediator, is someone that can be fair and unbiased. Okay, we talk about this all the time in mediation circles, but practically speaking, the conversation generally seems to extend only to a conflict check. So as long as the mediator hasn't gone to law school with one party or stood up for them in their wedding, it seems to be sufficient for checking the unbiased box, okay? But truly, I find that often when I talk to parties after administering a mediation, one of the number one complaints I get is that one party or the other felt that the mediator was biased toward the other side. And a lot of times this is very surprising to me because the mediator was able to successfully settle their case. So I'm expecting that they're going to be delighted and I'm going to get a great report. And so to hear that they feel the mediator was biased made me kind of realize, hey, there's more to this than I think we in the ADR industry really pay attention to. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about detecting subtleties or subtle bias, and how we can kind of prevent ourselves from kind of going into that place in mediation. So today my guest is my resident bias expert.
Notions about different cultures that we were talking about. My interest in that grew just from working with my students. And once I got into the corporate sector, I noticed that this was kind of a hot topic when it comes to recruiting and human resources and places like that, where we're trying to get out in front of our bias and make solid judgments. I then went on to become certified in unconscious bias.
Okay, great. So, what's interesting about bias is bias can indeed cloud our judgment, and it has the power to force us to make substandard decisions or to hold irrational beliefs that influence our next steps. So this is why I really wanted to dig into it a little bit as it relates to mediation. So when I first heard you speak, you talked a little bit about the horn and the halo effect. And I thought that was particularly interesting. So can you explain those to us?
Certainly. The horn effect is kind of how it sounds. You have this idea that someone has horns. You're looking at them in a very negative way. Maybe it's because they did something, or maybe it's just because you perceive this person to be not a great fit for a certain job, or they might be deceptive in some way. A lot of this comes from no evidence. It's just a feeling. The halo on the effect, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's where we look at someone in a very positive light, that they can do no wrong. And that, again, is based on just my gut feeling or a preconceived notion, not necessarily rooted in fact or evidence.
Okay, so I've heard about this, like attractive people are often credited as being also intelligent, when that may not necessarily be the case, or overweight people are credited with being lazy when that may be false. Just these kind of assumptions that we make. So I've heard a little bit about that. And that's kind of interesting because I do think that I think we're wired to kind of make those sort of quick decisions. So it's good to be aware of that. What I really found interesting when you spoke, where I think this plays into mediation in a big way, is you talked about the affinity bias. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Definitely. So the affinity bias is where we gravitate towards one party over another. And the affinity can be based in we have the same profession, or we're from the same place, or if this mediation happens to be a situation that I've been before, I might sympathize with the party that is most like myself or had the situation that was most similar to my situation.
And I think for sure, a lot of the mediations that I've been involved in and have scheduled, there's almost always the mediator is also an attorney, usually, or a retired judge who is an attorney. And they've often either practiced on the plaintiff or the defense side. So automatically, if they spent 30 years fighting with insurance companies because they were on the plaintiff side, they might have a negative affinity against, the insurance company representative, and more of an allegiance, if you will, to the plaintiff side, and vice versa, of course. So I find, that's pretty fascinating. Can you give some other examples of an affinity bias?
Definitely. When I meet people for the first time, I usually take stock of some things about them. If they're wearing a specific sports team logo that I also like, I might gravitate more towards that person. If they are a similar hairstyle, or maybe they're a similar body shape, they might be a similar race or religion or something like that, where I'm going to gravitate towards that person because I have some similarities with that person. And sometimes there's similarities that I really hold strong to, such as maybe if I'm very passionate about what my religious beliefs are, and I find that this person has the same religious beliefs, I might gravitate towards them. It's not going to be so much that we are the same height necessarily, unless I feel very passionate about my height, then I might gravitate towards that person.
Interesting. I had an interesting example or experience with this. I had read, years ago that when we hire people, that there's a lot of statistical data that in hiring, we'll often hire people that are similar to ourselves. And at the time I was reading Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, and she had a lot of science and data on this. And at the time I had a really great administrative assistant, and she was moving on, and I tasked her with finding her replacement. So, she goes through tons and tons of resumes and whatnot, and she kind of pares it down, but her number one pick, I walk in, and her name was Maddie, and she was a, probably about 40 years old, petite, dark bob hair, Italian, horn-rimmed glasses, mother of twins. Okay. And I walk in, and her number one pick is a woman like Italian, mother of twins, dark hair, bob, horn-rimmed glasses, Italian, everything. Like, it was like bookends. And it was so funny to me that as I was doing the interview, I just kept cracking up. And I just couldn't control myself. And I was like, they're going to think I'm nuts. So I had to, of course, explain why I was laughing. But that for me was really an indication of how powerful, this can be, So let me ask you this. Do you think that if a mediator feels more aligned with one party or another, that they may be buying into the credibility of their case more? Like, would it go that deep as to kind of tilt the scales?
It definitely can. The science is very clear about our unconscious brain versus our conscious brain. Our unconscious brain processes about 11 million pieces of information every second, and our conscious brain only filters through 40 pieces of information every second. So everything that's flowing in the background of a mediator's mind is unconscious to the actual mediator. That can lend itself to aligning with one party over the other. It could be affinity bias, like I've been through this circumstance before in my personal life, so I can relate to what you're going through and I sympathize and empathize with you. It can also work the opposite as well, with I have done so many of these cases. I know exactly how it's going to turn out. And they're cookie cutter type cases. I already know how this is going to go.
I
So
see
the
that.
bias can be towards a party, or it can be towards the case itself.
Yeah. I see that a lot. So many mediators are like, I've seen this 1,000 times, you know, bing, bang, boom. And that is its own sort of bias. You know, it's interesting, in some of the mediation training that I do, we dig into the concept of body language, okay, reading body language and the science behind it, how to use it for rapport building. And these are really helpful, you know, chapters that we go over with mediators. What's interesting though is what I've learned from that is bias isn't really necessarily a negative. We are wired to make very, very fast assumptions with regard to our safety, harm, you know, stuff like that. And so subconsciously, we're just looking and saying, hey, this person looks like me, they are like me, they look like all of my relatives, they therefore are likely to be more safe. Or this person, I can't see their hands, they're hiding them, I should be more wary, I need to vet them. So this is just kind of how we're wired. And so for a mediator, I think really needs to be aware, look, you are wired this way. It is a good wiring that you are making these assumptions, but you have to be aware that this is occurring and that you're not conveying it, or it's not, again, allowing you to make decisions on faulty information. So to that end, you know, what's interesting is in the body language science and all that what we talk about, what I learned is there's things that we do that will put people ill at ease, and things that we will do, body language, that will make them comfortable. So for example, we'll talk about mediators, you know, like if they talk with their hands or they hide their hands, sometimes that gives a different message. Somebody will feel uneasy if they can't see your hands, and they won't understand why. Okay. So I wonder if we have a bias, is there a vibe that a mediator might emit that they are perhaps, you know, biased against somebody or towards their adversary, that you could identify, or that they could identify and purposely try to, you know, adjust?
A lot goes into body language, and it's difficult to say what a mediator should do and should not do, because it's not so much what they're doing, it's the beholder and how they're going to be interpreting those movements. It can also be about like the tone of voice, the way they're sitting, their facial expressions, anything like that. It's hard to say what they should do and what they shouldn't do, because culture plays a factor here. Someone
Mm-hmm.
who looks just like me in terms of eye color, skin tone, and all of that, we may look alike, but we may be from two different cultures. So we may have different interpretations of that
Mm-hmm.
types of body language. So that's what makes this so hard about unconscious bias, because it's not so much me confronting my own bias, but it's also being aware of how can I be perceived by others. I'm sure you've heard, especially in business circles, that perception becomes reality.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those reports you were talking about, that you feedback report, you actually get the opposite because of whatever factors played into their situation. So I can't really definitively say what you should or should not do, because it's not just culture, but it can also be trauma that's embedded in somebody's background, whether it's them personally or it was handed down from a parent or somebody like that still reacts to a certain stigma or perception of a stigma. So that's a tricky one. I can't really give you like the do's and the don'ts of what to do with your hands and what to do with your face, because it all depends.
Is there any wording or something that you think a mediator could say to assure somebody, not like, hey, I'm not biased, don't worry, but is there perhaps some wording that would make somebody feel like, hey, this person's on my side?
I think that's tricky too, because I don't know enough about your business to talk about liability, but sometimes factual information is the best place to stay. For some people, they are going to feel very comfortable if a mediator is very prepared. They've read the case. They have all kinds of information. They've done their research. They know what they're coming to the table with. For other people, it's more of an emotional sort of feeling where this person is going to be caring or motherly in a way. So that is also going to depend on the party and their background and how they perceive those types of actions.
You know, often in cases, a mediator or the parties will have a discussion. You know, if this case doesn't settle today and it goes on to trial, there's often a discussion or a rating in every file as to how the plaintiff will fare with regard to the jury. Okay, so a lot of times a minority plaintiff in a minority area is going to fare better than they might in another area. And this is actually something that's cited. It's a tangible, you know, in civil cases. Would you say, you know, a jury liking a like, you know, plaintiff, would that generally be halo effect, or would that be affinity bias, or both, in your opinion?
It could be both. That's one of the reasons why we see in different court cases that are concerning a white perpetrator against a Black victim. Sometimes the jury selection is a majority of white individuals, and you'll see one of the attorneys asked to move the case to somewhere else. They're trying to mitigate bias in that circumstance, especially if they know that the culture of that area has certain beliefs and values that could work against the case itself. Okay. So a lot of times we're talking about affinity bias plays into this a little bit. If you can get the jury to sympathize because they've been there before, or maybe they can empathize, if the attorney can set up a really good narrative of the person's story and really evoke some of those emotions, they might have a better chance of winning that case, which would be affinity bias coming into play. Okay. The attorney who is representing the opposite side, who's representing the perpetrator, is probably going to be hoping for the halo effect, that they are going to want that jury to look at this person as innocent. So they're even going to ask them to wear a suit, cut your hair, be clean cut, you know, appear in a very wholesome sort of manner, because that's going to play for those biases to move that case in the direction that they want. The opposite side, who is representing the victim, may try and go with the horns effect, that they're going to try and demonize this person. So both sides are going to be fighting and leveraging those biases for the jury. And whoever can script the best narrative and convince the jury one way or the other, they have really pulled the strings like the marionette and using those biases.
So interesting. What now, do you sometimes have people that refute or challenge the notion of subconscious bias? And if so, what's your response usually?
Absolutely. Most people feel like if you have bias, you're a bad person. And I don't know where we've received that message exactly, but that's another one of those subliminal messages that we have lodged in our brains. So to confront bias, it's really easy to show people some different examples. For example, we might be talking about a surgeon and their patients, and, you know, start asking questions about the surgeon, and someone in the audience inevitably will start referring to the surgeon as he and him. Mm-hmm. So there's a bias right there, that we automatically assume that this surgeon is male and not female. So we all have those tendencies, and whether we're willing to confront them or not is really the agent of change or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, like I said, I've kind of learned about bias from the positive side, from the science of body language, reading it and understanding it and, using it. It's all just stuff from a safety perspective. Like if somebody's crossing their arms, it's generally sending a message, hey, stay away, or I'm not, buying into what you're saying. So, our brains are really trained to pick up these little social cues so that we know what next steps to take or not to take. Right. So it's kind of interesting because this is kind of that flip side of it. So, those are all the questions that I had. I just want to thank you. I appreciate your being here. And I just found this really to be very riveting. And I hope some of the mediators in the class are going to find it to be so, and on our channel. So I'd just like to say to everybody, if you like this today, please subscribe to our channel, follow us, like us on Facebook, and have a great day. I'm Hillary from Mediation Master Class.